We are now going to take your photographic knowledge to the next level in this and the next two tutorials that follow, since they are the foundation to transitioning from auto modes to manual mode. I guarantee shooting in manual mode will be easy if you watch this and the following tutorials, and it all starts with understanding dynamic and tonal ranges in photography, since they both relate to your exposure, and you'll soon find out your camera's limitations to the dynamic range and how to overcome them to get the exposure that you want. Dynamic range and tonal range, what are they? Well, let's find out by exploring dynamic range first. In essence, the dynamic range in photography refers to the range in which your camera can successfully capture the brightest and darkest areas of a scene without losing detail. In nature, you could say there's an infinite level of brightness, from blacks and whites and grays in between. This brightness range can be measured in stops. Now, we did cover stops in photography previously, so if you need a reminder, check out this tutorial right here. Now, your eyes and your camera are not capable of seeing every level of brightness depending on the intensity of the light in your scene. When it comes to your eyes, you can see around 24 stops of brightness levels. High-end cameras range from 10 to 14 stops, and lower end or older cameras like my Fuji S2 is closer to 7 stops. So that means your camera is not capturing detail in the darkest areas of the shadows or the brightest areas and the highlights. Now, if you expose for the highlights, you'll capture those details, but will lose details in the shadows. This is known as exposing to the right, which is better than exposing to the left or for the shadows. The reason being is it's easier in post-production to bring back some shadows versus highlights. Now let's compare dynamic range to tonal range. So the tonal range also refers to the brightness levels of a scene, but it is directly related to the tones captured by your camera. So here's another way to think of dynamic versus tonal range. Imagine your Ferrari has a range of 0 to 255 miles per hour. That's its dynamic range. Now, imagine your spouse installs a speed inhibitor and changes the range from 0 to 60. That is the tonal range, since it's been limited to a smaller range. All right, now that you know your camera has limitations, here are some solutions to overcome its inability to give you the exposure you desire. So one thing you can do is control the light by diffusing it or by adding more light to the shadows. Now, if you are a landscape photographer, it's going to be more difficult to control the light in that way. So what you can use is a polarizing filter or a graduated neutral density filter that will darken the sky and your landscape if you have one like this where the entire filter is dark. But they do make graduated ND filters where only a portion of the filter is dark. That way you can darken the sky only and bring the dynamic range into a smaller range for your camera to capture all the detail in that dynamic range. Or what you can do is what is known as HDR photography, which consists of taking 3 exposures, one underexposed, one overexposed, each by 1 stop, and then a 3rd exposure in between. Then in post-production, you can merge the 3 exposures to get more detail in the shadows and highlights. Now, if none of those options are ideal for your situation, then you have to decide what is more important in the scene or easier to deal with in post-production. Then you'll have to expose to the left if it's the shadows that are more important, or exposed to the right which is what is my recommendation. Now the question is, how do you know what tonal range you're capturing? Now, although your camera doesn't have a gradient tool, it does have another tool that can show you visually the tonal range you've captured and whether or not you have the correct exposure for that scene. We're going to cover that in the next tutorial. So if you're ready to elevate your photographic skills even more, click right there to get started with episode 11.